Hello, everybody, and welcome to a brand new series with the Butterfly Princess Show. I'm collaborating on this series with Amy Taylor, who is from America. She's based in New York in the US, and she works trying to raise awareness about stigmatizing from all different areas of life. And one of the things that she's very passionate about raising awareness of and raising awareness of the stigmatization and sort of changing people's perspectives around is sort of the issue of sex work and what all that entails and the stigmas that involves. So we've teamed up, Amy and I, on this series called Sex Work, where we're going to be discussing various different issues. Episode one today, we're going to be looking at the historical perceptions of sex work, how sex work was sort of perceived in the ancient world, so like the Mesopotamias, ancient Greece, medieval and the resistance period. We're also going to be looking at 1 minute. What's it now? Just 1 minute. We're going to be looking at the Victorian era, the 19th and 20th centuries, Victorian era, the earlier 20th century, and the late 20th and 21st, early 21st centuries. We're also going to be talking about the sexual revolution between the decades of the 60s and 70s. And also we're going to be discussing modern perspectives. So it's going to be a really interesting series, this series, and I hope that people will learn a lot from it and be able to look at sex work in a whole different sort of perspective. So I'm sorry, I'm just getting my papers sorted. So hi Amy, thank you for joining us today. So
hi, it's so nice to be here.
It's been really great that you've agreed to do this series. So before we start, just so people get to know you a bit, could you tell us a bit about what you do and why you're passionate about raising awareness about misconceptions around the sex work industry and why you want to change people's perspectives?
Yeah, so my name's Amy Taylor. I'm on all the socials as Amy Taylor NYC if you guys want to catch up and see what I've been up to. And yeah, I've done a lot of different things in life, but one of them is I've worked in sex work. I've been a high-end companion, and sex work is an overarching umbrella that includes lots of different kinds of work. And as I head toward the sunset of all that, it is very important to me to try to leave some positive impact on an industry that I know very well for over a couple of decades and that I've seen is part of a crucial part of society, a valuable part of society with millions of people in it who are overwhelmingly good people, but that also has a lot of problems. I would argue all of those problems are directly or indirectly caused by people's attitudes towards sex work. None of them would exist without that. I understand social norms have a place, but the degree to which sex work has been harmed by society, even as it's been the third rail of marriage, it's been a survival mechanism for many of the poor and young. I know tens of thousands of retired sex workers that are just fine. I know some that are not. Again, the reasons are indirectly caused by societal attitudes towards sex work. They are always, and I mean always. And so it's important to me, if I didn't do something to try, and I don't know that I'll succeed in leaving my world and my people that I care about in a less harmed way, then it would have all been for nothing. And so I will continue to stand for my people. And basically, we own our bodies. The state does not. Crazy people who want to control us do not own our bodies. We do. And no government's ever going to change that. We see throughout all of human history that they never have and they never will. And so I'm of the attitude that we can do a lot in the harm reduction space. And look, people, even if you hate sex work and hate sex workers and their clients, you know somebody and love somebody who is one or has been one. I promise that you do. You may not know it. And you do know a client, former or current, and you may not know it. And so these are people, they're part of our world, and we can do better by them. And today we're going to talk about the history. So I'd like to talk about the fact that we have always existed. And guess what? We always will.
So talking about like you just said, so like we're talking now about the history, as I mentioned, sort of like the ancient civilizations, so Mesopotamian, ancient Greece, and stuff like that. So, like you said, sex work and sex workers have always um, existed, even from many millennia ago. So let's talk about firstly about Mesopotamia and ancient Greece. So how
like
was
I said, our work has existed in various forms throughout history. Cultural attitudes have evolved over time. There have always been kind of taboos, but those have been more or less, those have been influenced by religion, culture, legal factors, and they continue to be. So if you kind of look at how previous societies treated us, you can think about challenging some of the enduring stereotypes and promoting social justice for what is millions of people in my country alone and yours too. So yeah, Mesopotamia and ancient Greece. So interestingly, sex work, and I mean erotic dancing and even outright sex for money, sexual acts, was often associated with the church and the temples. There were temple prostitutes. They were considered sacred, and they were considered to play a vital role in rites of worship. Now, I know that's hard for people to think about, that if you went to your temple, mosque, or church, that you would have hookers there. But honestly, I think that'd be kind of lit, but I know people don't agree with me. Jokes aside, yeah, they were involved in worship and fertility rites because they tended to be the young and fertile. And so they had a different relationship between God and sex than we have a very sex phobic one now, particularly in Western Caucasian culture, but maybe in all. But that wasn't always the case. It was complex in Mesopotamia. And then a little later, ancient Greece also had a kind of a complex view. Most people know that those cultures were also different to LGBTQ rights. It was much more normal for them. But also, while some forms of sex work in ancient Greece were stigmatized, others were well respected. There was a term called hetarai, Hetairai, for those who want to Google it and read about it. Those were kind of educated courtesans. They were fancy. Let's be honest, they were like me, or geishas in Japan that many people have heard of. And they were also often well respected for artistic abilities, intellect, and they worked in contrast to lower status brothel workers. That is similar to how it is now in many countries. And we call it the whorearchy. Get it? Hierarchy. And it's not great because no human is better than another, but status is part of society. People judge each other based on accomplishments, status, family, wealth, looks, all these things, abilities. And so Greece did have kind of the high-end courtesan thing, heterae, and then brothel workers that didn't fare as well. And then in the rest of the ancient world, we can think about ancient Rome. huge, very successful society for thousands of years. They tried legalizing, regulating, and taxing our work. We were required to register, which of course is terrible because once you're on a registry, you are kicked out of housing, work, you are stigmatized forever. So in their effort to regulate, they caused actually a lot of stigma. Databases are tough that way. And so we got marginalized, we lacked social standing because of these registrations. But the work was legal, so they weren't just outright thrown in prison, so that was nice. But the Rome kind of viewed it as a legal necessity, a social necessity, albeit one that was stigmatized. You can think of that as the same way it's handled in a lot of Europe or Canada or Australia now, or the way strip clubs are viewed in America, that they're legal, but they're still very problematic and they still stigmatize and punish the workers that work within the systems. So ancient world wasn't perfect either.
Of course, of course. And now I wanted to like discuss the sort of medieval and Renaissance period, because obviously, you know, we're talking about the church and obviously very religious. Now they had a sort of different view to the ancient world because they sort of saw it as especially the Catholic Church influence led a more moralistic view of the work of sex work. They sort of viewed it as a very sinful act, and sex workers within the medieval and Renaissance period faced a lot of severe punishment because of the work that they did.
That's correct. You're exactly right. In the during the Middle Ages, perhaps driven by there was a lot of hygiene problems, dirty water and the plague and things. When societies get very afraid of germs, they see a lot of communicable disease and death, they tend to get moralistic. You saw that in the COVID pandemic. People were pretty awful to each other when they were worried about disease. So I tend to think of the relationship to disease as also the relationship to morality, because you do see that in a repeated cycle. So yeah, in the medieval and then in the Renaissance, the work was considered very sinful. Sex workers faced severe punishments, and yet they always existed and they always had clients who loved us, because the dirty secret is that clients love escorts and they just lie. In my country, they vote. All of our clients are conservative. Almost all, not all, but almost all are conservative Republicans who vote against us and then enjoy our labor, which will never not make me angry. But whatever. I mean, I buy a piece of fish at the store. I don't know if it was treated ethically. I get it. You don't really owe the workers that you employ all of your ethics, and you don't have time. But in the medieval era, we were here and we survived. But there were brothels. They operated and some were allowed, you know, paying off the law enforcement, but it was kind of the same thing as Rome. They thought of them as valuable to prevent greater moral decay, but they hated it. And then later, a little bit later in the Renaissance, they again tried in Venice, the Italians again tried to sanction, tax, and regulate it. They acknowledged that there was a persistent demand for our work, as there is everywhere in the world. Men love whores, and they always will. However, there was a lot of religious pressure, and we were again stigmatized because, as usual, we were seen as necessary because we are, but yet morally corrupt. The Jezebel, like you see that now, where men love OnlyFans, but they hate the women who do it. There's a combination there of envy, women that can make their own money in a way that men simply cannot, for the most part. And slutty women are hated because they're women who are living the way men would like to live, or do live in a way that we decide women should not live. And so there's this hatred of a woman who's both independent and sexual. And that was true in both the medieval and the Renaissance period, as it is today.
And obviously, we're now entering sort of the 19th and early 20th century. So like the sort of the Victorian era in Britain, and it's obviously Britain during that time was a colonised place, and this period highlighting moralism. The work of sex workers has been seen as a social evil, and were often portrayed as victims of their own morality as fallen women.
Yes. Yes, and in the Victorian era, they valued women's sort of weakness and softness quite a bit. Women were infantilized, and viewed as an asset or a liability or both to men. And so there was this panic that no woman could be a sex worker of her own volition. She must be sort of trafficked in slavery. There was quite a bit of racism around it, it was, they talked about white slavery, that the mysterious brown man was selling white women. And you still see that trope today. The Mann Act in my country, MANN, was enacted to go after Black men who had white girlfriends because they said that they were selling them into prostitution. So there was, in the Victorian era, they definitely thought of women as unable to be sex workers who were happy. They must be slaves, which of course is false. There are women being forced into sex work. Where that happens, it's awful, and we should go after pimps with full force. I believe the only good pimp is a dead pimp, frankly. And a lot of people agree with me, but there are a lot of sex workers who are very happy in their work and content. I know thousands of them. They're fine. But we couldn't imagine that in the Victorian era. And then as we got better with medical testing, the Britain made great strides in medicine, spectacular, and in lifespan. But they used some of their strides in medical testing to subject sex workers to mandatory health inspections. That's not a bad thing. We do that in brothels, and it's good to control disease. The pornography industry does that too, and that's a good thing. But along with that came a lot of stigma. For instance, brothels in my country, you cannot leave for the weeks that you work there. And that's because they say you might spread disease, right? You might leave the brothel, sleep with some guy, come back with something, but it ends up making the brothel effectively a prison, right? Under the guise of medical safety. So again, complicated in England in the 19th and early 20th century, as usual.
And obviously, this act that was introduced was called the Contagious Diseases Act, and this was introduced in Britain, and it was aimed to control the spread of STIs, like you say, by subjecting sex workers to mandatory health inspections.
Yeah. On the surface, that's not a bad thing, but where it's used to, again, collect databases and then harm people, you lose your medical care, you lose your housing, right? Databases are scary things. They collect information, and information can be used to harm. So again, I don't have any better ideas. I'm not against medical testing of sex workers to control disease, but everything's got an upside and a downside, as usual.
So obviously, as well, as we move to the earlier 20th century, so we've moved on now from the Victorian era, and this 20th century saw a shift towards criminalisation and repression influenced by a growing feminist and social purity movements. Obviously, I don't want to go into too much about feminism in this episode because that's going to be a future episode. But again, so like, even though it's a society, sex work has always been there. There's always been this sort of stigma, and even though things are more legalized now in other countries, which we'll talk about in episode 2 about cultural attitudes, there's still a lot of stigma because feminists and all that.
Yes, you make a brilliant point. The horrid nature of being a sex worker is that both sides hate us. The religious conservatives hate us, and the feminist liberals claim that we promote entitlement of men and patriarchy. So we get it from both sides, which is real fun. And that did start the feminist movement. While it did a great deal of good worldwide and in my country, they thought of sex workers as sort of Jezebels that promoted the patriarchy. So yeah, we get it from both sides, which is real fun. Nobody's an ally. And yet both sides love to hire us, which is,
Yeah. So, and then obviously we move on then to sort of the late 20th and early 21st century. So the sexual revolution of like the 1960s and the 70s brought again more specific significant change for sex workers because the introduction of the sexual revolution challenged traditional norms around sexuality and sex, and obviously made people be more open and have more honest conversations around sex and
yes,
everything being.
worldwide. I mean, the people love to make fun of boomers, and yeah, they've done some things, but they did do a lot for civil rights. That generation, with its great privilege of less war and an incredible economy, they've done a lot for civil rights, including for sex workers and for basic sex positivity. So, yeah, Coyote is a great worldwide organization. In my country, SWOP, actually, not just my country, you have SWOP, that's SWOP, Sex Workers Outreach Project. There's chapters in most major cities in the world. You can find one, people, if you Google, if you want to get involved and help or be an ally, or just speak out and say that sex workers are human beings. Even that does a lot. If you want to be our friends, even if you don't like us, you can just tell people that a dead hooker is not a funny joke and that we are human beings because we are. And that started in the early 21st century, where people just wanted to be a little less phobic around sex. And it was pretty revolutionary that people wanted to do this. And I think it was good.
Yes, of course. And we're going to talk about like modern perspectives and common cultural attitudes in episode 2. So this now, ladies and gentlemen, concludes episode 1. So thank you, Amy, for sharing, the ancient, taking us on a bit of a history tour about the world of sex work and sex workers. I hope you can all tune in to episode 2, where we'll be looking at cultural attitudes.
Stay tuned, friends. Thanks
Yeah,
for listening.
thank you. So I'll stop recording now and then we'll just jump straight into episode 2 if you're okay with that.
Okay, I'll let you redo an intro and things. I'll
Yeah,
just wait. Okay.
yeah.